You are now watching the official YouTube channel for the largest basketball manager game in the world. Join at BuzzerBeater.com if you think you can beat the buzzer.
What is going on, everyone? Welcome back to Bubbles Buzzer Beater, the official Buzzer Beater YouTube channel. We are here with another video today, and I have a familiar face, or not face, I guess just familiar voice on the channel today, and that is Mediocrity. Mediocrity, feel free to say hello.
Hello, everyone. How's it going?
And we are just here to talk about the most recent draft in Buzzer Beater, because there's a couple different things for this season that changed about the draft, primarily the boosted 19-year-old draftees, and then also the increase in the amount of 5-ball potential prospects. So there's a lot more MVPs, Hall of Famers, all-time greats. So those 9, 10, 11 potential players, there's a lot more of them this season. So we're going to dig into, kind of those changes, talk about, why they happened, go over a little bit of like conspiracy theory about why there's so many MVP better potential players, and then just kind of talk about how this impacts U21 teams, national teams, and just the buzzer beater market as a whole. So Mediocrity, I guess we can just kind of start with just the 19-year-old draftees in general. I know that 19-year-olds used to be just as weak as 18-year-olds, and no one really wanted them, and then they've slowly gotten better and better. What was your expectation when you heard that the 19-year-olds would be boosted where they could spawn with level 10 prominent skills?
Yeah, I mean, the first time I heard it, it sounds pretty strong. If you look at it, 10 skills, that means they're maxing out at 100 TSP possible, though that's probably never going to happen. But it sounds a little bit too strong, and I think seeing the first 19-year-olds, it might be a little bit too high, just because we're seeing a lot of high 80s TSP 19-year-olds, which is pretty hard for any 18-year-old to even hit. So it's a little strong, but at the same time, the 18 has the advantage that you can choose what skills you're training, and a 19 might spawn with less than ideal skill distribution.
Yeah, so you get to mold them a little bit and decide what you want to do with them. But it's definitely interesting because I know when they boosted the cap for skills for 19-year-olds up to 8.5 way back in the day, like it was such a minor change that people are like, cool, 19s are still kind of useless. And then when they were up to proficient skills or 9.5 max skills, that's where it was kind of in the part where it's like, okay, I'll actually look at drafting them. Like, I think you can turn them into solid prospects. And then, as you mentioned, this season, I mean, you and I have both seen some crazy 19-year-olds that were spawned with like 87 total skill points,
Yeah.
88 total skill points. I think the highest that I've seen was 89. Did you ever see any that were higher than that?
Nope, 89 is the highest I saw as well. I think.
Yeah. So if
6 or 7 above 80.
Yeah, I say if anyone's seen a 90, I'd be curious to hear if anyone drafted a 90 total skill point 19-year-old. But yeah, those mid and high 80 total skill point guys are pretty crazy. So and then I guess your preference. I know you talked about a little bit on how the 18-year-olds, you get to mold them a little bit more, so there's a benefit there. But for your personal preference, would you prefer 18s over 19 still, or is it really just dependent upon the specific process at this point now?
I think it can be dependent. In most cases, I would still prefer the 18s just because you can build them into the player you want. But there's a few specific 19s that I've seen that I would definitely prefer over any of the 18s. So I think kind of the top end 19s that spawn with really high total skill points that are in good skills, I would prefer those over any of the 18s. Just because you can have one less year of the youth trainer, so you're saving a ton of money there off the bat, and you can have some of their skills, like the inside skills, start at 10, which tend to take longer to train. So it can put you in an overall advantage if you get the very best 19s compared to the best 18s.
Yeah, I know, especially like I saw some draftees where they spawned with 10 skills in the spots where I'm like, oh, that's actually interesting, because if they spawn with like 10 jump range, 10 passing, and 10 rebounding, it's like, okay, if I'm training a small forward, those are essentially already done for like the first six,
Yeah.
7 years of training. So it's like they're slightly behind. Maybe let's say they spawn with like 74 total skill points, where it's a little bit lower than what you'd hope for like a 19-year-old, but the hard skills are already like trained and done. So it's an interesting kind of comparison there.
Yeah, for sure. And on the other end, you can get a bad skill distribution where maybe you have 10 rebounding on your really short player, or something else like that that you wouldn't want as much. So there's
Mhm.
upsides and downsides, but if you get the right skill distribution, I think the 19s have the advantage.
Yeah, the 10 rebounding on the 6 foot guard that you're trying to build into like a national team player, that's probably like a horror movie. That's probably not a
Yeah.
good thing. But and then the interesting thing that I was talking about with some other managers was how this boosted 19-year-old draft class will like impact U21 teams moving forward. So I know that you in the past have been a U21 manager. I obviously have as well. And I think for the United States and other bigger nations, it might not have as big of an impact, but especially for like micronations or like mid-level nations. So like if we think about a lot of the teams at like Americas, for example, those like mid to smaller countries might have a lot more stability towards the bottom half of their lineup. How do you think this impacts U21 national team specifically?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you said. With the small nations, some of these 19s can even be a rotation player for him right away,
Yeah.
which will make a big difference. Because a lot of times the small nations, they can have a couple good players, but they lack depth. So having more more prospects that are already part way there is going to help them a lot. And I think even for the top nations, this will have an impact, because the very best 19s, like see the one that we saw that spawned with 89 skill points,
Yeah.
can probably be one of the very best U21 players we've seen. I mean, if you start at that high of at 19 and you're trained correctly, you could get upwards, get probably get close to 130 total skill points, if trained correctly.
Yeah.
Um,
I'd
that'd
imagine.
be pushing it, but yeah.
Yeah. If you think of it in terms of, so I know that you mentioned like the 10 total skill points is what you think of, like, okay, well the technical max is 100 total skill points for a 19-year-old, and obviously we'll never see that. I'd say about 90 total skill points is the most you see. For 18-year-olds, the most you usually see is right around like 65 total skill points. I'd say of like the super high end, 65 total skill points is insane. So if you think, okay, so I drafted the best of the best 18-year-old with 65 total skill points. And then you're like, okay, let's see. I got the full rundown, high level trainers, gym, everything. You're looking at probably at most like 22, 23 pops at the very most, I'd say. And then that probably puts you, still below those elite 19-year-olds. So once again, if you get lucky with the 19-year-olds, they're pretty overpowered. Do you think it's something that buzzer beaters should look at pulling back a little bit and adjusting in the opposite direction, or do you think holding it as is for a couple seasons is still fine?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to see kind of what happens over the course of a few seasons. I think the 19s might be, they're a little bit higher risk because you might get the skills that you don't really care about as much. But at the same time, I think there's a few too many spawning with high 80s total skill points. Maybe if it was a little bit more rare, then it'd be a little more balanced.
Yeah, and that's actually a good transition for talking about rarity because, as you know, and a lot of people listening know, this is the first draft class that does see an increase in the amount of MVP Hall of Famer players, so 9-10 potential, because Buzzer Beater came out with the structure of every single draft for every single league is guaranteed at least one 5-5 draftee, so five star rating, 5 ball potential draftee. Every league is promised one, unlike previous seasons where I'd say about 75-80% of leagues probably had one or multiple 5-star potential players, but this is the first season that every league is guaranteed one. And you had an interesting theory about why we've seen so many more. Not just like, okay, every league has one, we know that, but there's so many more than we were expecting. Do you want to talk a little bit about the theory that you had as to why there's so many more?
Yeah, so basically, I was thinking there's two different ways they could have possibly implemented this to make sure every draft has a 5-5. One is they just run the draft as normal, and if it's missing a 5-5, they add one in. The other is that they just take every draft and they give them a 5-5. So even if they give them a 5-5 and then they generate the other draftees. So you might get multiple 5-5s in the same draft. And really that means that you have, I mean, with the 85 or so active leagues in the US, you get 85 extra 5-5s. Whereas if they'd implemented it the other way, you'd probably get maybe 30 more 5-5 prospects. And the reason why I think it might be the first way, that they just added a 5-5 to every draft as, say, the first pick, and then they generated the other draftees, is we saw maybe almost a 3 times increase in the amount of Hall of Fame players that we saw, which seems a bit high for just making sure a draft had a 5-5 rather than adding a 5-5 at the start to every draft.
Yeah, so essentially my theory was exactly the same, and just same exact premise, but just explain it in a slightly different way. So essentially, what you and I both think happened is that the first 47 picks were as designed. So let's say in an average 47 pick draft, let's say on average there's 5-star or 5-ball potential players. So that's 2 MVP or Hall of Famers right there. And then the 48th pick, BuzzerBeater just said, okay, every 48th pick is going to be a 5-5 prospect. Whereas, like you were saying, the other option is, okay, they simulate the draft, and then for any that are the unfortunate 20% drafts that used to not have any, we replace one, add a guy in there to make sure that there's at least one. We are on the same page of, it seems like there's an extra one for every single draft. So rather than having one for sure, it's an extra one per draft, if that makes sense to people listening. So interesting there. But yeah, there was a lot of MVPs, Hall of Famers, and then we also had, was it 5 all-time great players in the United States?
Yeah, 5 18-year-old all-time greats, which usually we see 1, maybe 2.
Yeah. So insane amount of 5-ball potential players. And there's a lot of things that go into, what this does for BuzzerBeater and what this does for different managers. My first thought was instantly like, okay, for drafts moving forward, what is the appropriate technique now? Because historically it's been like, okay, if I don't have a top 3, top 4 pick, I shouldn't invest in the draft at all. Has your opinion on the draft changed in that if you're like maybe let's say a top 8 pick or top 10 pick, more in that like 7 to 11 pick range, is it worth investing in the draft now because of this increase in useful players, both for 19-year-olds and Hall of Famers? Or are you still in the mindset that, I don't want to spend scouting points on the draft unless I have a top 5 pick?
Yeah, I think it's definitely worth it to spend points at a lower position in the draft now. Just if what we saw this season continues with the next seasons, there's so many good prospects that you can probably get one even a little bit lower down the draft. And then, but the other way to look at it, and I think this leads into what might be your next point, is that if there are so many more prospects, yes, you can more easily draft one if you want to train homegrown, but you're also going to have more available to look at on the transfer list. And maybe with more available to look at on the transfer list, you might be able to find a better deal.
Yeah. So it's the old like supply demand conversation of like, okay, prospects who are Hall of Famers used to sell for a lot more, and now they might sell for less because there's so many more Hall of Famers. So it's like, okay, well, the demand is still high, but the supply now meets that closer than what it used to. So that brings the value of all of them down a bit. So interesting conundrum. Obviously, you don't want to like base everything off of just this first season, but I think in a couple of seasons, we'll be able to start kind of projecting how transfer list prices, especially on like 18, 19-year-old rookies during the first couple of weeks of the season, have changed from previous seasons, because I definitely think that we'll see a difference in value per se. Any other thoughts on the increase in the draftees that you wanted to make sure that we touched on in terms of the increased amount of them, or how it impacts transfer list value stuff? Anything training wise that you think this adjusts in terms of how many people are training prospects, or do you think the percentage of training is going to stay about the same? I guess take this wherever you want it. Any other thoughts on the increase in Hall of Famers and MVPs?
I think it'll make it more worth it for people who want to train homegrown trainees. Just before, it was really hard to find a Hall of Fame player in the draft, and there's people who've tried drafting a Hall of Fame prospect to train themselves for many seasons and can't find one. But I think it's a much more likely to happen. So if when people are wanting to train players they drafted, I think that's going to be a big boost for them.
Yeah, one other thing that I also thought of when in terms of the draft itself, scouting combine is something that's not going to be as useful or worth the 10 scouting points, because what scouting combine does is it reveals the ages and heights of all the players. And if you don't care as much about 18 versus 19-year-olds anymore, which most people probably don't, since the 19s are so much boosted, so much more boosted than before, the scouting combine is not likely something that I'll use scouting points on moving forward. Would you concur with that statement, or do you still think it's useful to reveal it for like the heights per se?
Yeah, I think I'd agree with you that the big impact it had before was that you got to see the ages and you could focus the 18s. It might be better to take those points and to spend them on maybe the skill reveal, because that'll be much more important if you're going to be drafting a 19 to look at their skills.
Yeah, definitely. And then the last kind of main section that I wanted to touch on with you specifically, because you come from a national coach scene, or you have a big background in national team coaching, since you're still the United States national team coach, is how do these changes impact like your scene? How do these changes impact national team training, national team planning, long-term like pool management for how many players they are, how you're pointing different managers to national team training? What does this do for your process moving forward?
Yeah, I think it changes it a bit. There's just so many more prospects this season that have a shot at making the national team. So at least for me, it means can focus more on the very best ones, because there's going to be so many good ones that really with the national team, only 2 to 3 players from every age group or every age are going to make the team. So of the 18-year-olds, probably only 2 to 3 of them are going to make it, and not to mention they're going to have to compete with the 19-year-olds from the next season. And so that's going to mean that the very best players are going to have to stand out even more. And it might mean that players might have to train more unique players as well if they want their guys to get a shot at the national team. So that's kind of how I'll approach it from the USA perspective. And then I think just kind of how it might go for everyone is I see this as being more helpful for some of the maybe smaller to mid-sized nations, since they tend to have a lot of people who are willing to train for their national teams, but they lack the prospects that the big nations have. So giving them more prospects, they know how to train, they're committed. They just lack the prospects. Once they have the prospects, I think they'll be even better. So I think there's a few nations to watch out for with that.
Yeah, so are there any specific nations that you were like worried about when you saw the changes of like those mid-tier nations that already have like a good foundation and now have like more supply, or was it just general middle-sized nations as a whole that you were interested in seeing how this will impact?
Yeah, I mean, a few come to mind. In Americas that we play against a lot is Chile. They're always really good, but they have less than 100 active teams.
Mm-hmm.
So them having even more prospects, I think will really, really make them a team we have to deal with every America cycle. Israel's the other one that is, they have more users in Chile. I think they're around 200, but they're always one of the top national teams, even from a lower amount of users. So if they get even more Hall of Famers, I'm sure they're gonna find ways to train them.
Yeah, and then the last thing that I had for like all-time greats versus Hall of Famers was I know that we talked a lot in this half hour or so about how the value of MVPs and Hall of Famers have likely decreased a little bit because there's so many more of them. How do you think all-time great players will be viewed now? Because what I was interested in or seeing was in the first couple of weeks, especially for the USA all-time great players, so the 11 potential guys, it seemed like they were selling for a lot. And I know that they were like very good prospects in general, but it seemed like people might have been actually valuing 11 potential more in the past, since the 10 Hall of Famer, potential players, there's a lot more of them. Do you think all-time great players are going to see like an increase of like people dropping 4, 5, 6 million plus on all-time great players moving forward, because it allows their player to stand out even more? Or do you think that's just a situation of just this singular class was pretty lucky for the USA, but moving forward, all-time greats are probably going to stay about the same?
I mean, if we have more 5.5s, we should have more all-time greats, and I think their value is always going to be really high. This season, we probably saw a lot of people go after some of the best ones because they had the money stored up. Might have less people with that amount of money as the seasons go on because they'll be able to buy the all-time greats. But at the same time, the all-time great, that they have the potential to make the national team, be the best player in your country. Hall of Famers many times can be the best player in your country, but it also depends on if they cap early, since some Hall of Famers will cap earlier than others. So it's just not as much of a guarantee as the all-time great.
Yeah, say, how many times have you as the national team coach been like following a player who's like on track for a national team as a Hall of Famer 10 potential guy, and then it just seems like he capped earlier than you were expecting, so he couldn't make the team? How many times has that been a topic of conversation?
Oh, it's pretty common and definitely frustrating for the managers.
Yeah.
It happens a lot, especially with bigs, since they really need to be on the higher end of their potential in order to have the same amount of big skill points as the top bigs on the team. So often see it with them where they'll just hit a wall and not be able to get the last 2 to 3 pops they might need to make the team.
Yeah, definitely frustrating after spending like 3 or 4 real life years preparing for him to make the team, and then it turns out he caps like 4 or 5 pops before you need him to make it.
Yeah, it's just one of those things in buzzer beater that's a little bit luck of the draw.
Yeah, a little bit luck of the draw and a little bit hashtag too real. I know it happened. That's like the real life NBA fan of like, hey, this player is supposed to be so good, and then he just never quite got to where he needed to be for your franchise or the team that you cheer for. So,
Oh yeah, for sure.
but yeah, anything else that you wanted to touch on in these topics? I think we covered a lot of good things. Any other things, either statistics wise, that you noticed, or like transfer list prices for these players? Anything else that you wanted to touch on in terms of the 19-year-old draftees or the increase in higher potential players?
No, I think we covered it. Just the 19s are definitely viable now, and some of them might even be some of the best prospects we've seen. We'll have to see how these managers do that have these high 80 total skill point 19-year-olds to see what they can take them to.
Gotcha. Yeah. And then I'd say last thing before I let you go, I do have to get your thoughts on it, because the other polarizing thing that happened for this new season was the auto bid feature. Any big thoughts or very pro, very con opinions on the auto bid that's going to be in BuzzerBeater moving forward?
I don't have strong opinions either way, which I know can be a lot of people do.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just monitoring it, trying to see how big of an impact it'll have. I've already seen it happen in some bid wars where you definitely have an auto bidder who has a lot of money in the bank who sets the high auto bid, and then it's easy for them to spend their money. But at the same time, when players have more money, they could have gotten the player before the auto bid. It just would have taken a little more of their time.
Yeah. I'd say it's truly like a convenience thing where I've seen some comments of people saying like, well, this is the end. I'm no longer playing Buzzer Beater after 15 years or whatever it's been. This is the last straw. I'm like, I don't think it's that serious.
No.
I've historically been a manager that's not like entirely for it. But I'm with you. I think it's primarily a neutral change, and I think it's something that people will definitely adjust to. So
Yeah, I'll appreciate the convenience and the not having to set my 3 a.m. alarm to get the prospect I want.
yeah, I'll say it's always good. More restful sleep for mediocrity
Yeah,
and bubbles. More restful sleep. So
yeah, I'm a little past my days of getting up that early in the morning for or in the night for a prospect.
Yeah, I definitely feel that. I know back when I was playing in high school, it like would be a non-issue. I'd be like, oh, I'll wake up at 3, and there was nights where it's like, okay, I'll wake up at 3 for this guy, and if I don't get him, I'll set another alarm for 6:30. No more. I cannot do that anymore.
Yeah, me either.
But awesome, cool. Well, it was a good conversation with Mediocrity. We appreciate having you back on. Fun fact, I don't know if you knew this, but you're actually the only manager that I've had on for like these joint episodes or interviews multiple times. Everyone else has only been on once, and you've been on twice, now 3 times. So I guess you're a official regular on the show.
Great. Well, I appreciate it. I enjoy talking about BuzzerBeater.
Yeah, awesome. Well, we will let you guys go, and I'll be back with another video very, very soon. So thanks everyone for tuning in.